Profesor Hausman, ¿nos oye bien?
Sí, perfecto.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, buenos días allí, ¿no?
Así es.
Pues vamos a empezar en un minuto o dos. Estamos esperando que se siente con nosotros. Bueno, ya llega el alto representante Josep Borrell y vamos a comenzar la sesión.
Ricardo, buenas tardes. Buenos días.
José Juan, qué gusto verte después de tanto tiempo.
Aquí estamos. A ver si nos vemos ya en 3 dimensiones, Ricardo.
Estos son sin micro. Estos son sin micro. Ponlo.
Bueno, pues vamos a comenzar la primera sesión de la tarde de hoy. Muchas gracias a la representación de la Comisión Europea en España. Gracias también al alto representante, el señor Borrell.
And many thanks to Mr. Borrell, and many thanks to all of you that are attending this session, and also many thanks to the International University. And the truth is that it's wonderful to be able to share this discussion with these 3 speakers, and it's wonderful to share this session on Latin America. And as regards the program of what yearly has become a classic in Santander, which is the QUO VADIS Europe program, whose title this year is towards a geopolitical Europe. And in the different sessions of this course, we're looking into the scenarios and the instruments that would be required for this geopolitical European Union to be achieved. And we have a session on Latin America. And well, I'm personally interested in this because what we should do is ask ourselves if Latin America is one of these natural spaces for a geopolitical European Union, and if the European Union has a consistent Latin American policy, and does it have a policy that corresponds to the demographic reach or the economic reach and the geostrategic and environmental parameters of the region. So we're going to be talking about all of these things this afternoon. These are questions that I think that we have to ask ourselves so that we can understand why we have a session on Latin America. We have one on transatlantic relations and a very interesting discussion on Russia that we had this morning. And let's say that for Spaniards it's very easy to answer this question, that is, if Latin America is an outstanding stakeholder in relation to the European Union in the foreign affairs policy of the European Union. We don't know if all the Europeans believe in this, and we don't know up to what extent these policies are specific enough, and we don't know if they actually cover the region and if they actually address the situation it is experiencing right now. In the next 70 to 75 minutes, we're going to try to understand what's going on in the region and also how the European Union, how it should reorient itself and develop initiatives for its Latin American policy. So we're going to start off with a 10-minute presentation from each one of the speakers, and we're going to be starting off with Professor Ricardo Hausman, who's a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School at the University of Harvard, and then we'll continue with José Juan Ruiz, who's the chairman of the Real Instituto Elcano, and then after that we'll give the floor to José Antonio Sanauja, the director of the Fundación Carolina. And the idea is that we have a few minutes at the end so that we can perhaps have some questions for the speakers, and above all, so that the audience, both online and in person, so that you can send us your comments or your questions. So, Ricardo, you can start now with a presentation of about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and it's wonderful to be on this panel and to be with the audience. and it really makes me feel proud to be here with you today. And very quickly, Latin America is not in its best moment. Let's say it's a region of the world that has had a crisis and has had the deepest COVID crisis of the entire world. And the COVID recession is occurring in part because in Latin America they've had the most severe lockdowns of the world. And this has been measured by Google or by Apple, and they've had the severest lockdowns and also the less effective lockdowns. Because in the world there are lots of countries, among them Spain, where you've had very severe mortality peaks and you've applied lockdowns, and when you do so, these peaks drop. And in Latin America, these peaks become very tall plateaus, and it takes them a long time to fall. So society is very affected by the recession that is hitting lots of countries, and for many of them it's the worst recession of their entire history, like Colombia and Ecuador. And for others it's not the worst recession of their history because they have a very complex history, but it's the recession that this generation is witnessing. And it's a recession that also has to do with these constraints associated with lockdowns. So Latin America, in short, is not at its best moment. But in any case, it's always easy to observe things that are not going well. And what we have to do is draw up a list of things that are not going that badly. The world is recovering very quickly, and this can be seen in the prices of commodities have been recovered. They were relatively high, so this is also pushing the economy, and the international financial markets are working well, the capital markets, and countries have had access to funding. They haven't been able to have the same taxation measures like they've had in Europe or the United States, which has made things a little bit more complex, politically speaking, in the recession. But they have had no macroeconomic disturbances as happened in other times, because in former times we ended up having a problem, so we ended up with a tax, a bank and inflationary crisis. So these three things have not happened. And let's only hope that they will not happen. But this has been very bad for the different governments. For the Colombian government or for the Chilean government, but also for the Cuban government. Or for the Brazilian government too. So there's been a political cost that has been associated with administering this economic situation. And the most affected countries or the most affected regions, as you can imagine, have to do with tourism. And it's going to take some time for tourism to recover. And I'm fully aware of the fact that the Schengen zone, well, we haven't been able to enter the United States for a year and a half, at least directly. So you can see how slowly this recovery is taking place. But I think that Latin America is going to have to overcome this crisis with worse tax accounts, and it's going to have to implement tax reforms too. And I think that there's an issue that has to do with international policies that is hardly ever discussed, but I would like to table it here, because it's a policy that was closely related to Europe, and until Biden came along, it didn't have the support of the United States. But I think that now things have changed, and I think that in Latin America, there's a lot of taxation applied to formal work and very little taxation applied to capital. And that means that formal work or formal labor represents about half the total amount of work. There's lots of informal work, and there are very low rates of taxation in the case of capital revenues. And one of the reasons why this happens is that, well, if there's a fear, and that is that if you apply taxes to capital, capital will flee. So they try to charge only a little bit instead of nothing. And this is due to this competition, what they call in English beggar by neighbors, in other words, or trying to be worse off than your neighbor. But I think that this can be seen in international agreements on minimum taxation so that tax information can be shared. And this is a significant element of the international framework that could make it possible for the tax agreement of Latin America be more progressive, so that tax accounts can be managed better, and so that they can be less conflictive. And we've seen the tax reform in Colombia, and the only thing they can think of is increasing the VAT, and that is hardly progressive. If they would have been able to increase capital taxes, or capital revenues taxes, or the corporate tax, or the income tax, and even in Latin American countries, the capital tax has a taxation rate that is even lower still. So, what I think, in a nutshell, that this is an international issue. And the second thing that I would also like to mention here today has to do with the pandemic, that also has economic implications, as well as pharmacological implications too. I think that guaranteeing a rapid vaccination is extremely important, and there have been bottlenecks in the supply of vaccines, but it's important for that to be solved. And I should also say that right now that the Delta variant is so contagious that I think that what is going to happen in the world is that everybody's going to catch the virus, those that have been vaccinated and those that have not been vaccinated. Well, the difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated people is the severity of the disease and the rate of mortality. But I think that we have to understand that we are all going to catch this Delta variant. So that means that from now until 1 year, this will finish more or less, because you either catch the disease or you get vaccinated or whatever. But let's say that vaccination is going to assist the recovery process. And then financial support for countries so that they can manage this situation is based at least partially on international politics administered by the International Monetary Fund, where Europe can also help, not only through the Monetary Fund, but also through other international instruments, so that funding can be provided. And right now, the European Union, is now making some significant transfers to countries of the south of Europe. And, well, they believe that this is absolutely essential for the recovery of Europe, and the same logic applies to the rest of the world. And it would be easier to do so. And in this regard, well, Europe, well, the same divisions we have between the north and south of Europe can be seen in the directories of this international body. Well, the north of Europe, they are pretty conservative on the financial front, but that's another issue. But finally, there's another subject that I think is very important with regard to the future, which is green growth. And I would like to underscore what are the key ideas behind this, which is that the world wants to go for renewables. And in Spain, it's a very sunny country. But there's one of the central ideas is that fossil fuels are much cheaper to transport than renewables, and that means that it's better to use renewables wherever they are. To do things that are energy intensive, so that you can do these things where the renewables are, instead of trying to transport this power. And I think that this is going to produce relocation of economic activities, and it's going to be sufficient to decarbonize the world. So many of these activities will have to be situated in those areas where they are rich in renewables. So there's a great potential of this in Latin America. I think that Latin America has a role to play in helping the world become decarbonized, but lots of investments will be required together with lots of knowledge and technology. Spain has a very good track record of investments in renewables. But for the rest of the world, I think that Europe is very focused on reducing its emissions, but that's only 11 or 12% of the emissions of the world. And the problem is, what can we do so that the world, not only a few people, can reduce their emissions? And I think that here we have a role for green growth that Latin America can play. And I would like to stop here. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and many thanks for finishing on time too, for finishing within the 10 minutes. Jose Juan, brief. Okay, we're going to ask you too to deliver a 10-minute presentation, as Ricardo Hausmann has just done, because he's presented three fields: economy, finance, healthcare, and green growth in Latin America. So we would like your presentation to go beyond the current situation of the pandemic, of the political agitation we're facing right now, and the political ill feelings we are seeing in Latin America. And I'd like you to tell us in which fields do you think that the European Union should observe very carefully when the time comes to setting its priorities in relation to Latin America. Thank you very much, Aurea. Hello, Ricardo. Hello, Jose Antonio. I've been to the Menendez Ballet many times, and when I saw these pictures, the last time I was there in person, I was with a friend who came along to seminars we've been holding for lots of years at the Menendez Ballet University. His name was Pepe Montes, and Pepe Montes has a sentence that is perfectly applicable to what's happening in the region. Pepe said that things are so bad that it even looks as if like next year. And I think that the description that Ricardo has just given us, I think that responds to the feelings of people that are looking at the region and where they can see that the situation is extremely complicated. But just to focus on what Aurora has just pointed out, I would like to review 4 major areas and see in each one of them what it is that the European Union could do. The first is what Ricardo has referred to, and that is the pandemic has been very harsh in Latin America, but the worst thing is that it has not yet finished, because in Latin America, with 8% of the world population, they have 35% of the fatalities, and right now this only represents 4% of the international vaccinated population. In Latin America, there are only 3 countries that have administered at least 1 dose to their citizens that are above 50%: Chile, Argentina, and Costa Rica. And in the rest of the countries, they are below that figure of 50%. And, well, you can't really think that there is going to be a sequential leap in vaccinations. So if the European Union, if it really wants to help Latin America, the first mission is very clear. And it has to donate vaccines, because if you don't donate vaccines, you will not get anything done. The crisis will never finish, because, well, what the crisis has demonstrated, what the pandemic has demonstrated, is that there's been a failure in the capacity that states have to protect their citizens in Latin America. And the second element that I believe is very important is the poverty shock. It's not that the peak has fallen by 8 or 10%. No, this means that extreme poverty has increased 3 points and affects 15% of the population. And that, well, the normal poverty, or the standard poverty, has increased 4 points and now stands at 15%. So we're talking about 30% of the Latin American population that is in a situation of poverty, once again, which means that this poses doubts with regard to how Europe has addressed Latin America in the last 15 to 20 years. that is Latin America with the emergence of the middle classes. We know that the middle classes emerged during the economic boom, but it has not been possible to carry on with this process or stabilize the middle classes, and this has humanitarian consequences without any doubt whatsoever, but it also has tremendous consequences for the future of the region in such a manner that Latin America should also remove that burden of the middle classes that prevent them from accessing humanitarian aid programs. And I think that Europe should become involved in these countries with medium levels of income, because right now they need help like poorer countries need too. And the third shock that I think is important, and where Europe should be absolutely intolerant, has to do with what we've seen in the last 2 years, which has been a process, well, in all over the world, but especially more so in Latin America. It's been a weakening of the institutions, and this weakening of the institutions in some countries is giving rise to clear violations of human rights, and it's also producing movements of repression that Europe should not tolerate. I think that what is happening in countries like Nicaragua or in Cuba, I think that they need to have a political answer, a political response from the EU, because we must never forget that Latin America is the eastern border of the values of the European civilization. And, well, we shouldn't only pay lip service to them, but we should also know how to defend them, because there are behaviors in which Europe, regardless of the diplomatic difficulties and problems, we cannot keep quiet. We have to speak up. And we have to speak up because what we are seeing in the region, what we are seeing in the world also affects us in the world. What we are seeing is that there's a struggle between democracies and populisms. There are authoritarian regimes. And in Latin America, this has been in motion for many years. And what we know is that democracies, no matter how weak and how vulnerable they are, we know that democracies make it possible to change its leaders, whereas authoritarian regimes don't allow these people to be replaced. And I think that this is something that in Europe requires foreign affairs policy, and it's a moral obligation, and there should be goals, but it should also incorporate the instruments that had to be used to preserve these objectives, and above all, it should evaluate the efficacy of what is being done. And I think that this is a tremendously important thing. And the fourth point that I would like to address right now is what Ricardo has pointed out. I think that in geopolitical terms, I think that the pandemic, or whatever will arrive after the pandemic, is going to change the map of the last 3 decades. Latin America is in a bad situation because they have lots of problems, there are lots of tensions, there are some threats and that are severe, but nobody can forget something that for me is very obvious, and that is that the geostrategic value of Latin America is increasing after the pandemic and will increase in this struggle over international hegemony between China and the United States. But if Europe really wants to have strategic autonomy, as they've mentioned many times, they cannot be pushed outside Latin America, because Latin America is the laboratory for the confrontation between the United States and China in terms of raw materials and natural resources. And don't forget that vaccines in Latin America have been mostly Chinese and Russia, and you've seen soft power there. And Europe has to be on that chessboard too, and it has to be involved because of something that is very clear, because Europe has placed in the center of its strategy decarbonization and the new Green Deal too. And well, let's say that nobody in the world can think even for a second that the world can be decarbonized by doing away or forgetting about what happens in a region where they have 35% of the water reserves, where they have 60% of rare materials that are necessary to produce batteries, lithiums and rare earth, and they also have the Amazon. So it's impossible to think that we're going to decarbonize the world's economy without taking Latin America into account. And this is an issue in which Europe can combine its strategic autonomy and its interest at having placed in the center of its identity in that new international map the issue of decarbonization. I think that it's absolutely essential for them to do so. And this has to be done with direct investments, and this has to be done too by putting our stakes on developing renewables in the region. But it also has to be done we have to stop looking at Latin America as if it were a thematic park for populism and economic irrationality or political irrationality or coups. We have to get Latin America out of that world that we've transformed it into, where it's a theme park. And Ricardo, I think in recent years, I think he's given something like 900 lectures. He's spoken about Maduro and Chavez, and nobody has asked him anything about this. And in Venezuela, there's an expert that could really contribute some solid arguments on what could be done about decarbonization. And every time I speak about Latin America, they ask me about Cuba, or they ask me about the Argentinian default, or about the most recent madness of Bolsonaro. But nobody is concerned about what is happening in the agriculture of Brazil or Argentina. And perhaps we should learn things there if we really want to supply food to the world. And this is a very clear issue, because Europe can place itself on the Latin American chessboard with two things: with resources to fund research and to recover intellectuals and the elites and the entrepreneurs that really have a contribution to make towards the global economy and the global conversation, and they're not doing so because nobody's asking them to do so. And Europe would have to make a tremendous effort at giving back the voice to those people that can really teach us things. Europe in Latin America has a partner that I think it would be extraordinary. It would be an extraordinary partner to address one of the issues of decarbonization that is very important in Europe, which is our agriculture, and through trade and also through technological innovations that have taken place in both countries, that are where we have the border of our research activities. They are the frontier. So that, I think, would be very powerful, and I think that Europe can get that done. And I think that it is possible to invite people to set up a network of Latin American think tanks that could participate in this global conversation, and this would be very enriching for all of us, and in particular for Spain, because we are possibly we are the people that know this region much better. And finally, stop thinking that Latin America is the theme park for irrationality, because what we've discovered in these last 2 years, well, in the previous 4 years in the United States, we've seen that irrationality has a normal distribution everywhere. There are irrational people. But what happens is that when you put your magnifying glass on a territory that already has that burden and which they're passive about, sometimes the whole thing collapses. And this would be my first approach on Latin America. And I would do so, I'd do so also, focusing on the region, but not only because of the positive reasons that I've just pointed out.
There is another reason which is quite important, and is when things go wrong in all these decarbonization issues, and in Latin America it is still a core issue. For the first time, Latin America is going to have more capacity to harm the world if it's facing an unbalanced situation. If Latin America is unbalanced and with a generalized crisis, unable to have coexistence, and with drug and as migrant countries or trade, this is going to be quite it is going to be a very good decision to get involved instead of just leaving Latin America and being observer of deterioration. Thank you very much. Thank you, José Juan. You have started saying that things are going quite wrong, and I think you have just described the situation. and trying to see beyond what we have in the region, which is a COVID situation, which is very serious, and political articulation, and this has enabled us to see such topics as deglobalization or de-taxation. How is it going to have an impact on Latin America? And Latin America also has to be taken on board for other subjects. And I think now that José Antonio Sanabuja is going to talk about an agenda, future agenda of Latin America. So if you want, you can just start with your 10 minutes. Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the High Representative and representative of the European Commission. Thank you for having invited me to this course. I would like to express my joy having this course here, because last year we were there, but we were here as well, but we were using a camera. We weren't in the room, so to be able to be back to the room is a great matter of joy. The response to COVID and the strategic economy are the three axes where we have a large transformation program of the EU for its own development and its relationship with the rest of the world. It is also the answer given by the EU to an historic crisis moment. In that sense, elements such as the budget agreement and the Next Generation program and its funding with common debt are going beyond certain number of messages. And in Latin America, we are sending an important message about the importance of the regional integration. And this, for Latin America that is fragmented, is very important. Of course, the COVID crisis has entailed powerful society and geopolitical response. Max Bergman said that it was a really geopolitical kickoff of the EU. And so these three axes, strategic autonomy, COVID, and Green Pact, is going to reorient our relationship with Latin American. Strategic autonomy, because it is important for both regions. If I quote Josep Borrell, he said that strategic autonomy is a matter of not having an EU between the United States and China and face the new discourses of a new Cold War. It is also a problem for Latin America. Not only the idea of a new Cold War is not only wrong, it would be for another session, but it is also very dangerous, and it is both for the Latin American or the European, the risk to be in a subordination situation that we do not wish. Of course, this idea has been a part of nationalist narratives, for example, and it is not going to respond to the logic that these are characteristic of the different actors and stakeholders among them. But what means strategic autonomy in Latin American and Caribbean region? What is EU geopolitical with a greater strategic autonomy? It means doing something that we are not doing. It is to be more present with a strategy towards the Latin America and Caribbean region, and not only acting in a reactive way in face of the crisis. Avoid that our actions should be reduced to Cuba, Venezuela. We have to have a global vision that should open doors and a narrative full of hope and progress, and not only a negative agenda with drug trafficking, humanitarian needs. And so in our relationship, this means that we have to recover a political dialogue of high level. We need also new regional partners. Latin America has lost a certain degree of power, but we are not helped by the internal divisions of Latin America that is highly polarized and fragmented. We haven't got a regional partner as a SELAC, and we do not hold bi-regional summits. 5 years after, in December 2020, we had a ministerial meeting where we got the commitment of organizing a new commitment at the end of a new summit, at the end of 2021, but I think it's not going to be possible. In this context, we have to promote flexible coalitions open with the different actors of the region and the different players. Of course, we have to open different options facing the game of power and other external actors. We are facing the rejection of the sanctions of the States on Cuba and the sanctions of the law Helms-Burton when Trump decided in 2017 to implement this law. The EU reacted, updating the blocking status. So this enables the one subject of the sanctions to initiate legal actions. And another stand of the EU in the crisis of Venezuela is the Group of Lima, and also a certain number of sanctions that are not only are not efficient, but they are going to have an impact on the citizens. And this is a factor that is worsening the humanitarian crisis of this country. It is important also to underscore two milestones. The AR declaration in the name of the 27 of the 6th of January 2021, defining the terms of the relations with Maduro, and also the one implemented together with Canada and the United States on 25th of June, calling negotiations for a democratic transition. And the ones mentioned, and those, and also we have to mention from this autonomous action, the coordinated negotiation of the member states of the EU that are part of the Inter-American Bank of Development, facing the candidate Claver Caron proposed by the administration Trump. But the lack of agreement in Latin America and the fact that of the opting out of Mexico when defending its own presence that was elected by the states, this left as a sole candidate as a Claver Caron. So the EU is a player, an important player in the Latin American region, and it was an example of multilateralism. And if we would have been able to reach it, we would have also signed the autonomy of this region. A few words about the Green Deal. We have said that the European Green Deal is not a pact that aims only at the mitigation and adaptation to the climate change. It is also a program very ambitious and was to transform the Agenda 2030. It is also the new framework of the Union's policy, and it is also renovating the narrative. It is also a framework for the renewal of the social contract and also renew the mobilizing narrative of the European construction. This is the Green Deal. It is also a key component of the foreign affairs of the EU, looking, of course, at the climate change. We have to promote the ecological transition, and we have to promote the Paris Agreement. And we also have to be more dynamic, and we have to get together with other partners. We have to sign alliances, and we have to promote environmental standards more demanding. And we have been mentioning it. It is what we call the Brussels effect, as it was defined by the professor Anne Bradford. So in essence, it means that the companies and authorities of other countries are going to assume the standards in exchange of the access to the market and European investment. So this is the case. Currently, we see in Brazil these companies that are adopting these standards and are accusing the government and to avoid to be penalized in accessing foreign markets. It is also happening with the standards on data protection and privacy. This regulatory power is a new expression of the geopolitical role of the EU. But I would like to underscore the fact that these standards can be rejected by the Latin American players as an expression of a new protectionism, green protectionism, or technological. It is an expression of an asymmetrical relationship that cannot be left apart. So we have to fight against these standards for them not to be considered as a neo-protectionism on the behalf of the EU. So there is climate leadership concern, the cooperation for development. We won't be able to fund those projects that are using fossil fuels. This is something that is in the Global Europe program. We also have a certain number of contradictions when talking about protection of investments. The current framework of investment protections can really hinder the investments of electrical companies, and in the Treaty of the Charter of Energy that should be reformed, as has been asked by Teresa Rivera. We have to think of the actions of the European Union and Latin American countries when we are talking about decarbonization aspects, when we have different agreements signed. And mostly when we are facing this dilemma, it is in the commerce, in the trade politics, and the agreements that we have with the Latin American, but of course we have a major dilemma, which is the agreement between the EU and Mercosur, which is also closely linked with the deforestation of the Amazon forest. This Green Deal is proposing explicitly the need to focus the environment issue in all the future agreements of the EU. This means including in all these agreements commitments, binding commitments with ratification and effective application of the Paris Agreement that is included in all the treaties of the EU with other countries. In this moment, we try to innovate the policy with a clause that was quite logic, that to say, to innovate in human rights and environment, introducing this kind of clauses. But a part of the discussion has focused this trade dimension. Both are important. They are at the heart of the agreement, but we have to avoid reductionist interpretation of the agreement. So we have two great challenges. One side, the geopolitical challenge, the need to enlarge the autonomy and to have regulation spaces facing the growth of competence geopolitical between China and the States. And also, we have to make this agreement to progress in the triple transition between the Latin American and the Europeans. We have to include digitalization and other technologies in order to foster the new industrial revolution, and also we have to renew the social pact and higher levels of social cohesion, and also to look at the decarbonization and sustainability. That's why the agreement among Mercosur and the EU mustn't be considered only as a free trade agreement. It has always had a political meaning. When we launched the negotiation in 1994, it was an answer to the hegemonic project of the EU and the states and the agreement of the free trade with America. When we relaunched the negotiation in 2010, we wanted to address a challenge of the presence of China and also to protect certain spaces and to diversify the trade relationship. This reason is there, and it is even more important today. But the agreement can be like a reassurance facing the risk of economic nationalism in the face of the fragmentation of the system. We have to repeat this. Mercosur and the EU are economic tools, and we have to bear this in mind. This is the logical interpretation. So what is the agreement, Mercosur? It has to be, first of all, a common ground for debates and also to head towards changing the model of production. And we need new changes. We need new standards within the EU to adapt ourselves to the requirements of decarbonization and the Green Deal. We also have to avoid this new wave to become a protectionist wave. So therefore, this regulatory change has to be carried out with consensus and shouldn't be imposed. So in that way, we cannot accept the environmental arguments as France does. But we need, but the fact of having a covered protectionism, it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the agreements with France. For example, the risk of having less standards in matters of environment and the absence of legal instruments to face the climate change. These have been important reasons to explain that citizenship and the European Parliament have rejected the standards. So we have to listen to these reasons. There are disagreements between the Green Deal, Mercosur, in its current states. But the solution is not to set aside this agreement. We have to reinforce its clauses, taking on board different clauses, and these agreements include already trade agreements and sustainable development. But we need more binding commitment, as it was mentioned in the Agreement of Paris. But I will close my speech, and I will underline the fact that Latin America and the Caribbean region, we need a European Union bringing up different interests, and we need to have a new agenda, a society based upon the society. We have to bear this in mind, because the EU is the only player that is near to America with politics that are addressing key issues: inclusion, social inclusion, gender equality, citizens' safety and security, environment, all what is means a renovation of the social pact. The bi-directional relation is an opportunity for the EU to develop this dimension in the Green Pact, and Latin America has to meet its objectives. And of course, with the COVID-19, we have to reinforce the cooperation. We have also to promote production. We have to create, as we know, the recovery funds, but at global level. But beyond that, the bi-regional cooperation should promote what has been called the positive agenda, an agenda of cooperation and a green agenda, and most of all, a social agenda. The socio-political agenda is important when we are will be able to face the new challenges. Only with that, Europe will be able to gain the battle. Thank you very much. Thank you, José Antonio. We have 25 minutes. So I would like those in the rooms to make questions, but I would like to ask questions to Ricardo, to Jose Juan. And I have a question. And I would like to get their opinion about two issues that are on the table in Brussels and also in Spain that are consuming a lot of resources, and they are making us face new great challenges, the EU, the States and China. And it is about Venezuela and Cuba. Setting aside your I would like to know whether you what Europe has done up to now, or what Europe could do. This question is very important for Spain, because probably no other country is more prepared or has a greater capacity to promote an agenda in Europe in this direction. Who wants to start? Ricardo? Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. I think that Europe's leadership has to be based on its soft power, and this soft power should be relying on values. These values are the secrets of prosperity. Prosperity gives to people a certain number of rights, and they can have, thanks to this prosperity, a certain power of reaction. And we need to have an environment where we can reach consensus, but the absence of this value is what entails the destruction of Venezuela. I've compared the big economic crisis. We have quite a great number of figures about during the Spanish Civil War. The GDP, according to the historians, fell up to 29% and was recovered in 7 years. The GDP has fallen on 80%, and we are still fighting. We have been fighting for 8 years, and we still are in a deep crisis. So it has been a huge crisis, much more than the fall of Germany after the Second World War. So this is the case in Venezuela, not because Venezuela has been through a war, but has occurred after the greatest boom, economic boom in Venezuela. Because this happens in Venezuela because Venezuelans were deprived of their economic rights, and they were deprived of the civil rights to be able to discuss, to have a free press, and they were deprived of their political rights to be able to change their direction when they thought they were doing the wrong direction. So I think that if Europe wants to be helpful in the recovery of Venezuela, and I could say the same for Cuba. It has to be at the forefront to give back to the Venezuelan their rights, and they are trying to demonize the questions of sanctions. Sanctions are there as a pressure to give way to a negotiation, but the negotiation without this pressure is of no use. During this year, the history of Europe with Cuba has not been efficient either. So I think that Europe has to recognize the governments which have been legitimately elected, and shouldn't recognize those who haven't been legitimately elected. This message should be very clear to Daniel Ortega, most particularly, and with his this move, he won't be acknowledged. He has to pay the price, the political price, and we have to do things this way. Otherwise, and like it's going to happen as with Orban or as with Polish. If the EU is not protecting values, we are going to see the same situation. So we have to be working hand in hand with the Cubans and not with the Cuban government or the attempts done by the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. José Juan, please. Well, thank you very much. Felipe González always tells an anecdote that I think is extremely relevant. He says that the first time he went to see Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, that was in 1983. And Spain was facing issues like the referendum on NATO, and they also had the beginning of a socialist government in Spain, and they obviously prepared 200 or 300 letters with notes to answer all the questions that Ronald Reagan was going to ask them. And the first question that Ronald Reagan made, which you can see in his memoirs, is, what do you think about what is happening in Cuba? And I think that this, has to do with Audia's question, which, Cuba for the United States is not a foreign affairs, it's domestic policy, and Cuba for Spain is also domestic policy, and it's not foreign affairs. So therefore, the issue, or what position are we supposed to take in relation to what's going on in the country, in Cuba or Venezuela? I think that this reflects much more than what we actually are, than our commitment towards major abstract values. And I think that the position reflects, Cuba says a lot about what we are like, and therefore I think that it's important to have a very clear response that can be explained, as Ricardo says, based on values. And I think that this is the absolute key issue, because what we can't do is cross any boundaries or any red lines in terms of values, because if we do so, we would be ready to negotiate anything. And before, I said that it's not only important to have good objectives or to have moral values that one wants to share. I think that it's equally important to analyze what kind of instruments you have and then measure the outcomes of your policies, of your objectives, and of the instruments you apply. And what Ricardo has just pointed out is very interesting regarding the European policy, the policy of the United States in the case of Cuba or Venezuela too, with sanctions as the key element. So it's very positive to see that the objectives were possibly adequate, that is the freedom of the Cubans and the Venezuelans, and the instruments that we use seem to be very effective, but the results have been very bad. Although it's equally true that the way we've addressed the principles and values that we believe in those countries haven't really produced good outcomes for us. So I think that policies have to be based on values, and I think that here it is absolutely non-negotiable. But I think that there's another very important issue. And Ricardo was talking about the Spanish Civil War. And the Spanish Civil War has a correlate of a very long post-war period where we always believed that somebody was going to fix the country and was going to put an end to Franco's dictatorship. And next year, well, the following year, Franco will die, and that's what the Spanish exiles used to say at home, and it never happened because the Spain was reconstructed by the people of that generation because they had values and they wanted to get things done, and they were offered the possibility of doing so. But nobody is going to solve the problems of Cuba nor the problems of Venezuela. It's something that necessarily has to be based or will be based on whatever the Cubans and the Venezuelans want. And this is absolutely essential to underscore. There are no such things as saviors. And the people have to save themselves, and the people need to have a framework of rights in which they can organize themselves and converge. I think that it's absolutely essential to insist on this and to avoid the temptation of creating a democracy in Iraq or creating a democracy in Afghanistan, because we've seen the results. But as Ricardo pointed out, it's much more urgent than in the past, because this time democracy is fighting against other systems that have soft power, that have money, and they're willing to go for this option. And this is, well, it's an authoritarian government. And like many of you already know, and Ricardo knows this perfectly well, the issues of corruption were key issues on our agenda. And the deterioration of the corruption agenda in Latin America has another very significant correlation with the appearance of investments where transparency, democracy, and values were not at all far-reaching. And I think that this is something that we cannot forget about. It's necessary to know that this time we have to play the match with values, but we are not the only ones that are playing this match. There are other people that are playing this match, and also, well, our relationship and our influence on them will also depend on what happens in Cuba and Venezuela, or as Ricardo said, in Nicaragua, and possibly this is one of the worst issues that we're dealing with right now. Thank you very much, José Juan. And José Antonio, and well, just to leave some time for questions very quickly, please. Well, yes, the political journal Exterior published an article where they spoke about Spanish politics and Latin American politics, and they said that one of the negative consequences that Venezuela has and that this debate has is that our debate on politics applied to Latin America become the image of deforming shape of our own domestic polarization. And as has been said many times, talking about Venezuela and Cuba, we're talking about our internal debate more than anything else. So this is something that also establishes a dichotomic vision that is terribly simplistic. And if this is the framework we're dealing with, what we are doing, well, this is an offense for our intelligence, firstly, and this also has a very high opportunity cost, and that is that we are not able to understand the diversity and complexity of Latin America. We cannot only focus on these dichotomic and simplistic images that are very polarized and that refer more to the low quality of our political debate, and it doesn't really refer to international politics. So firstly, we will have to get out of discourses of that kind. And very, very quickly now, in relation to Venezuela. And the truth is that since the changes that took place with the proclamation of Professor Guaido and his recognition by a number of countries, well, there was an international approach established to have a quick solution to the problem. In any case, many things have been tried, from the Cucuta and the Gedeon operation, and all of them have failed, and the country is now facing a transition, and like what Chile had or what Spain had, it's going to be much longer and much more complex than what we believed was going to happen. And I'm not going to refer to Maduro's regime. And what I think about that regime, well, I think that most of us think that it's not a friendly regime. But in any case, let me please focus on the other side of the equation, and that is democratic opposition. And I think that we have to recognize that there is a very serious problem in terms of democratic opposition, because it's a fragmented opposition, and it's an opposition that has been there for many years and has ignored the concerns of the Venezuelans. And the survey data that we've used are from the Catholic University, well, two of the main survey operations of the country say that the positions that have been adopted by the government of Juan Guaidó and that some other G4 parties have adopted are very far away from what most of the Venezuelan population wants. It's a population that is against the sanctions established by the United States, and some leaders are in favor because they hope that this will make the regime topple over, and with very low levels of popularity, because we need an opposition that has enough capacity to recover unity of action, leaving out, as has occurred in other transitions, those factors that are focused on violent solutions. And secondly, we need to have a position that addresses the concerns of most of the Venezuelans, and something that has to do with their living conditions and with the agenda of rights that Carlos referred to a few minutes ago. So we expect that, well, we want the opposition to abandon maximalist strategies and to accept that this is going to take a long time, and it has to be done gradually, and therefore gradually construct cohesion so that we can build an opposition, because right now the opposition isn't powerful enough, and this has to be rebuilt. And the democratic position has to be done well, and you have to win elections so that you can reconnect with society, so that you can articulate and build leaderships. And here there's a calendar in the country that I obviously believe offers the opportunity of reconstructing the democratic policy with sufficient power to be able to apply pressure on the regime and force a democratic transition, which, as has been pointed out, depends much more on the internal actors and on the protagonism of the Venezuelans, even though the external actors, including the EU, can provide support in the process. Well, okay, we have exactly 5 minutes left, and I'm going to address a couple of questions. Very quick questions, please. There's one over here, and there's another one over there. Okay, so, well, could you please start? Oh, yes, and we need a microphone. Yes, so hold on a minute. We'll get a microphone for you in a couple of seconds. So we're going to have a couple of questions from the audience. I would like to ask Jose Juan, Jose Antonio, and Ricardo that if there's anything you don't want to answer, well, just please let me know. Or if you have any question that you would like to answer, rather, I'll give you the floor. The microphone, please, over there. Well, thank you very much. This has to do with the national situation. Could you please say something about the situation in Colombia? Because, well, this is they are welcoming lots of Venezuelans there. But how can you implement a peace process that I'm afraid is not in its best moment either? And the other question is over there, please. Could you hand the microphone to that other person? Hello, good afternoon. Well, considering the profile of the panelists and considering what's happened in El Salvador and possibly what will happen in Argentina, I would like you to talk about the effects of something that hasn't been specified here, that hasn't been discussed, and that is the expansion of crypto coins in view of the monetary instability of Latin American countries. Thank you very much. Okay, the questions are very specific. One of them has to do with Colombia, and another has to do with the expansion of crypto coins in Argentina. The case of Salvador is very outstanding too. So who would like to start? Who wants to open fire? Okay, Jose Antonio, about Colombia. Well, very quickly, because Colombia would require a very careful analysis. No, sorry. well, you have to be very, very short in the answer because we have the panelists joining us now. Well, very, very quickly. Well, Colombia has taken some very positive steps, and they deserve to receive international support because they've given lots of support to displaced people, and most of them are from Venezuela. But apart from that, Colombia is facing a very complex situation with social mobilizations that have been made worse by the pandemic, and the response from the dialogue has been very scarce. The dialogue has been very scarce too. And it's been a very repressive system, which obviously doesn't promise anything good. So the country would require a dialogue. It would require a much more intense social dialogue. I'm sorry that I could not be more specific, but I'm afraid that we're running out of time. And as regards crypto coins, then, well, I don't know. Well, just one comment. I think that we have to distinguish between crypto coins as one of the mechanisms that are, it's one of the very opaque because of, well, things that have to do with narco trafficking and with illegal economies and black market economies in the region. And I think that we shouldn't really give this any tolerance whatsoever. And another completely different thing has to do with the development of crypto coins by the central banks, because in the region we know that some very interesting experiments are taking place in Uruguay, in Brazil, in Chile, and well, what they are doing, they are using the crypto coin technologies like blockchain to generate instruments that are much more regulated, controlled too. And the truth is that the instability that Latin America has, if you add on to that the instability of its means of exchange, I don't really know where there are any gains. I do see that there's an improvement in opacity and in transferring illegal resources, and I think that this second motivation has to do more with what has happened in El Salvador. Apart from saying, look, I'm here, I'm ready to negotiate, which is what happened immediately. And once the announcement was made, the Monetary Fund mission travelled to El Salvador, and this is something that I think explains what I've just pointed out. But in any case, I think that what we should focus on is on the serious attempts that are currently underway at the central banks of the region to not be left behind, not only in the case of crypto coins, but also in the digitization and blockchain processes too. Ricardo wants to say something, I think. Ricardo's muted, I'm afraid. His microphone is off. Your microphone is silenced. You're muted, Ricardo. Thank you very much. Well, what I was saying is that Colombia is a democracy, and all of this debate, all of this mobilization has to do with the fact that next year they will be holding elections, and it will be primary elections, etc. So there's a political channel through which it will be possible for people to express their unhappiness, and people will be able to choose their path and debate things. And this is what you don't have in Venezuela. Colombia has been very generous with the Venezuelans. But Colombia has received about 1/10 of the people received by Jordan with the Syrians, with the Syrian refugees. So there's a lack of solidarity all over the world in relation to the issue of Venezuelan refugees. And this makes life much more complicated for the neighboring countries. And I think that there's an important agenda to look into. And as regards what José Antonio pointed out, is that we have to be much more patient with the Venezuelans so that political constructions can be built. Well, the truth is that the Venezuelans won 2/3 of the National Assembly in 2015. But they imprisoned the political leaders and they had to leave the country. Many of them had to leave the country. So, therefore, this is an opposition that is taking place without a democracy. So, yes, we have to be patient. We need a strategy. After 22 years of this regime, I'm not sure if this is the correct recipe. But the problem is that, well, we have to try to make the constitution be respected, which didn't happen, and we have to change things. But it's not about giving more time to a regime. The only thing that it has done is create a bigger and bigger disaster and more destruction. And this is the reality we're facing. So giving more oxygen to a destructive regime is not the right path to follow towards the future. Well, yes, I just wanted to underscore what Ricardo has just pointed out, that is the generosity of Colombia in this process is absolutely a world example, a first-class example. It's spectacular, and this has not been recognized. And I think that this is an issue that should be underscored, at least because they've generated a movement of humanitarian aid, and well, very few countries have done this, and well, nothing has happened to them. And well, just think about what has happened in Europe with the Syrian crisis, with the Syrian refugees, because in Colombia, yes, they get 10 points. Well, thank you all very much to all the participants for speaking in less than 1 hour on such an extensive issue. Many thanks to the participants for having limited themselves in their questions, and many thanks, well, to the panelists of the next session who are on the waiting list, as it were, in the waiting room. Thank you all very much. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Bye-bye.
I don't know if you hear me. We just, as you see, transitioning from one session.
Estamos